Welcome back to the Corporals Almanac. This is your host, Andy, and today we've got a great episode. In this episode, we're visited by Lucy O'Hagan, who manages Wild Awake in Ireland. We talk about ancestral skills, finding place and identity, and what it means to live with our ecology. So hopefully you guys enjoy this episode, and please, if you want to support her work, go check out wildawake.ie. So, Lucy, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you. So, Jadif, Lishuk Niegan, Shanam Dom. Hello, my name is Lucy O'Hagan. I am currently in the far northwest of Ireland, in County Donegal, in Donegal. I'm taking a breather and spending time with family and spending time with the land. And so since I suppose 2015, I've been involved in running different projects. Most notably would be Wild Awake. People are most familiar with me. Before that, I was running a forest school, which kind of led into doing the work that I now do with Wild Awake. So yeah, the mission of Wild Awake is rekindling cultural and ecological resilience here on the island of Ireland. And I've been absolutely loving it. That work has changed and evolved in many different directions with many different collaborations. Right now, the things that are really exciting for me is this kind of cultural revitalization of Gaelic culture, and with that the lifeways and the traditional skills that come with that, the spending time on the land, just being with people outside and sort of giving people that gra, that love for this land that we're on and the communities that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think here in the United States, when we hear of Ireland, we think about the pasture lands and things like that, and the forest tends to get ignored. We assume that it's either it's been stripped and isn't there anymore, and that's not necessarily the case. Although Ireland does have a very complicated history with a forestry existence where it's kind of ebbed and flowed. So it's really interesting that there's that much interest in that. I'm a little curious how that kind of plays into this conversation about culture and identity and those things that we might not associate, and maybe that's an American thing, but getting in touch more with that forest component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it certainly is the case that a lot of our forests and land has been degraded, both through farming, through intensive sheep grazing, through the oak forests being felled over many hundreds of years. So, and now the state management of forests is specifically citrus spruce. And it's being grown with lots of chemicals, and it's grown specifically for pulping. So there isn't a lot of ancient woodland left at all. And there are lots of on-the-ground projects at the moment to ecologically rewild certain patches of land, one of which I was out at this morning. And it's really inspiring to see how quickly the land can regenerate when certain types of management are being used. But definitely in large parts of our national parks, there's a real issue with deer and with, I'm not entirely sure the ins and outs of why that's happening, but certainly the rewilding project that we're working on is on one side of a national park, and there is much more diversity on this one patch of land, even just after 8 years of this kind of holistic management. But I think it's, it is interesting to think about what people's perceptions of Ireland are, and particularly within the diaspora, thinking that there are these people in Ireland who are so strongly in touch with their traditions, when in actual fact that isn't completely true. And that is due to hundreds of years of oppression and of removing people from these traditional and ancestral lifeways and from that connection with the land. So it feels like here on the land in Ireland, and particularly with the connections of many diaspora from afar and coming back to Ireland, that's really being reignited again, which is so exciting. And what that looks like is, people are becoming much more, where I am at the moment is a Gaeltacht, so people will still speak Irish. A lot of the schools are in Irish. You go to the shop or the pub and people are speaking Irish, but it's been people have fallen out of relationship with the language here. And there's a real desire to relearn it. And what I'm experiencing is that the connection to the land and the connection to, what we call nature is so embedded in this language, which is at least 3,000 years old. So like the words that are kind of persisting through this language show us like what an intimate connection we had with the landscapes and the particular even crevices of the land, that are there to be re-evoked and invoked.
Yeah, that's awesome. That raises like a million questions that I have. I'm really interested in both. You said like there's holistic management, and I'm interested if that means more of how the land had been managed, maybe like pre-agriculture. So like lots of coppicing, hazels, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also in totally different direction, just based on what you had talked about. The concept that because of the diaspora, folks who are not from Ireland wanting to get in touch with those things and pushing, I'll call it homeland Ireland, to reassess its relationship
Mm-hmm.
with some of these more traditional practices. Well, I'll ask the first one.
Mm-hmm.
If you could speak about those holistic components just a little bit. You don't have to go like too deep into it.
Even if I wanted to, it's definitely not my area of expertise. And I suppose my interest is much more in cultural rewilding, but I am now collaborating with somebody who is much more experience with ecological rewilding. And his approach is like herd grazing over small paddocks, like intensely in certain places and moving them around. And then, yes, also like there are old coppices on the land. So like speaking about restarting those as well. And it's really interesting, like we have, he has neighbors peering over the fence thinking like, why does my land look like this and your land looks like this, even though you've just had a load of sheep moving around it. So yeah, I can give you his details. He will speak like much more in depth about it, but it is definitely like traditional management practices. And yeah, potentially what this land would have looked like when we had more big predators moving around as well, or any big predators moving around that weren't just humans with guns. And I think what's been really interesting and what we're very conscious of doing is like involving the community and speaking to the community on the ground here as much as possible. Because what we've witnessed in other rewilding projects in the UK is that sometimes people will move into a certain area and they will impose their will onto the land, which is, of best intentions for the land to will itself, but without the kind of swell of the community there. It's just like another project that's going to be very damaging. So that's been a really interesting and ongoing process as well.
Awesome. I'll swing back to that second half about the cultural component. I'd be really interested to hear about, especially with the work you're doing, the role of people that are historically indigenously and identify with Ireland, but maybe aren't so ingrained in the culture that they are trying to attach themselves to something that is much more ancestral.
Can you maybe rephrase it? I'm not sure I entirely know.
Sure. So you had mentioned like there's a little bit of an influx in folks they didn't grow up in Ireland.
Yeah.
But they seem to be driving some of this interest in more of the traditional knowledge.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to know, like, is that something like in your workshops that you're seeing percentage-wise a higher rate of folks that are not Irish in terms of like having grown up there?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, like how that's relating with a lot of these return to these ancestral knowledges, ancestral skills, the return or the newfound interest in Irish. It's something I actually see with my own wife. She's got the Duolingo app and she's been trying to learn Irish because of that like lack of connection with where her family is from.
Yeah.
So I'm interested on your side if that's something you're also seeing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. It feels too early to tell. Having said that, there have been and there are people who are Irish or Scottish diaspora who have been coming to my classes, and it's kind of incredible how much they know. Do you know, like that their Irish is way better than mine or anybody else in the class, that they have such an intimate knowledge and love for the mythology and the traditional skills of this land. And it's kind of amazing, and I definitely, when I set out in this work, I didn't realize that I was going to have such a large following from North America and like also Australia. But it makes so much sense now that there like are these people who had to leave. And now with the really important conversations that are happening and the movements that are happening there around land back and decolonization, that people there would be looking back to their own ancestral roots and trying to find out, well, what is my culture? You know, like what are the rituals that make sense to me? And so that's kind of where I'm finding myself at the moment, which is like it was unexpected and is still kind of interesting to me, because so much of what I'm trying to do is re-inspire people on this land to have like pride and love for the land and to feel comfortable here and to decolonize that, you know, and to restore that which is severed, which was intentionally over a long period of time. Yeah, there was a process to remove us from those things which sustained us. So yeah, it's been really interesting to feel like these influences and what feels like a real kind of, you know, it's a yearning and it's a hunger, but there's also this beautiful exchange happening of people reminding us, you know, like reminding us or like spending so much time like researching certain archives or folklore and saying, do you know about this? Like, do you know about this story? Or have you heard about this plant being used in ritual? And I think that's such a beautiful exchange and like so gorgeous to have like, you know, this net cast across the world that there are all these connections which can then contribute to, you know, decolonization here in Ireland and that restoration of, you know, relationships essentially.
Yeah, you talk a lot on your website about the regeneration and ancestral skills in regeneration and restoration. I think most folks are pretty familiar with this concept of like ancestral or primitive skills, but at least here in the US, there's like a lot of baggage that comes with that because of the settler colonialism that exists here. Further, I think it's also driven heavily by like a really fundamental individualism that we think of that's, I think, more unique to the United States than other places, but that might be my own biases. But within this idea of like ecological and cultural regeneration, it becomes a bit more nuanced. I've heard you speak about it a little bit, this idea of place and time within the landscape. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's definitely it's complicated ground, you know, and when I first began this work, there was very little like that happening in Ireland apart from bushcraft schools or survival schools, and they were very, you know, macho places and these kind of this culture of like survivalism, you know, of like I will go out into the woods and I will survive the night until I can come back to my house or come back to civilization. I don't know, just I don't belong in those spaces, and I there wasn't that there wasn't that space for me. Also, like for me, it was like such a process of love, you know, and of tenderness and gentleness and grief, and that was obviously not tended to in those spaces either. So it was really in looking to the States and this movement of ancestral skills, and very early on I studied anthropology in university, so I was kind of aware of these very negative connotations around the word primitive, so I would have never gone there, and ancestral just felt kind of it sunk into my bones a little bit more. But I was seeing these people practicing this. And like, I have to say, you know, we've mentioned Peter already, but Peter Michael Bauer and the work of Rewild Portland was such a huge influence on me in beginning Wild Awake, and the way in which they approach learning ancestral skills with such integrity and reverence for the people who are on that land already, and acknowledging the power dynamics and the difficulties of practicing that as a white settler on those lands. So it's been really interesting to bring that back to Ireland and to think about, okay, well, like, what is this here? Because, you know, I am a white person who is on the land of my ancestors practicing these skills which have a real founding, and they have such a grounding here. And what does that mean? What does that look like here? And it's so rich. And the more I do it, the more it's kind of, I don't know, I really feel like this want from the land for that to continue. I suppose like one thing that I've always been really appreciative from Peter and Rewild Portland, and what I felt very early on, was that it wasn't really about skills at all. You know, it was like the skills are fun, and I feel like a deep connection to the land when I practice them. And I think it's really important for people to do them in community and to recognize like the intelligence of them and the relationship that's required with the land, to become immersed with them, and just how incredible our ancestors were to have lived with this for so long and have lived such regenerative relationship with the land. But like ultimately, when we're practicing those skills in the here and now and practicing those skills during collapse, like it's so much more about creating community resilience than it is about me being able to go into the woods and make a bow drill fire. Do you know? It's just about the relationships that are born out of coming together to do those things, like both between people and with the land and all of the ecological relationships around us, and coming to like remember ourselves as nature and to reclaim those ancestral lifeways that are ours. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like I'm really into the concept and the idea of these ancestral skills, but whenever I do them, I can't help feel like I'm like cosplaying a little bit, like that you're doing this thing, then you just go back to your house and it's like, okay, I can start a fire or whatever it might be. And that tends to go away the longer I'm doing something. You almost like, I don't want to say your brain shuts off, but you like go into like, it's very much like ancestral in the sense that I feel like after a while your hands almost know, it's like this very ancient memory that kind of exists within us in our DNA after a while, depending on what exactly I'm doing. But I struggle, and I imagine there's a lot of folks that are interested in this stuff that struggle with this idea of like, okay, you can go out and learn how to do XYZ, but that's such a small component of these ancestral skills that took lifetimes to develop and perfect. For folks that are interested in this kind of stuff, what do you recommend in order to kind of get over that block of what's the point if I'm only going to learn one thing and that's not enough? And I feel like I'm just like pretending to be one of those, like you'd say, like those macho, stereotypes of I'm going to go out in the woods and survive the night.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to hold that question, and that's going to be different for every person, like of why am I doing this, and what do I feel when I, have a relationship with a certain plant, or like what is the wider cultural or community implications of me knowing how to forage for wild food, and particularly when like food sovereignty is like such an important thing to be looking at. I rarely do these one-day classes anymore. When I was beginning, I would often do like a one-day introduction to fire, or, a one-day foraging walk. And sometimes like I still have to do those things because I'm still surviving in capitalism, but like what feels more important and more alive for me is to have like these kind of immersive programs that not only bring in like ancestral skills, like we are living outside, we're living like as a community, we're cooking outside. We might learn how to tan a hide or weave a basket or track animals, but like that is also within the context of learning about why we are even using, or like what has happened to get us to a place that we are rewilding, like what happened, what are the wider systems that we need to understand? What are the implications of the powers and the privileges that we have? Yeah, I just think that that's so fundamental, so that this doesn't, it will continue to be a word that is constantly co-opted by everything from like, I'm seeing it on strawberry farms here, and like, people, it's such a sexy word, right? To rewild, and then like, what does it actually mean? And particularly when it came out of like anarcho-primitivism, it's like, well, what happened for us to get to this place? And trying to understand that and trying to speak about that with people in a way that's like, we want people to understand and to feel like a capacity to change, And then I also like bring in a lot of this kind of soul work, and that's really important to me as well. And the storytelling and yeah, just like these opportunities to cultivate like curiosity and wonder and awe so that like we can remember ourselves as these really imaginative creatures, you know, that create ritual and have fun and play together and grieve together, and also like know the importance of destroying these systems of power within which we live, which have completely severed us from these practices which bring us to life, essentially. So yeah, I mean, I would say that like ancestral skills are really fun and I love them. And I think it's beautiful to kind of come back to that sense of like the source of where everything has come to. But for me, they're always just a vehicle to something deeper.
I think that's a really great transition because we've talked a lot about this physical regeneration, whether it's the landscape or our ability to do things. But you do focus a lot on spiritual regeneration, and you've kind of hinted at it a little bit here. So why do you think it's important to reclaim some of these practices and stories versus just saying, you know, that's a part of the past. Let's fuse the world we live in today with some of these ancestral skills and, you know, the new age atheism or whatever you want to talk about. You know, why is it important to go back?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about like making it relevant for where we are here and now. And yes, we'll go back to retrieve some of those things and or some of those rituals or some of the practices that we had, if we can find them, to make them relevant for now. Because I think like it's so important that we have space for ritual during collapse, that it is as important as going out and protesting or regenerating the land, or it's just like one of the most human things for us to do, I feel. Yeah, like just last year, they found a reindeer bone in a cave down in Cork, so in the southwest of Ireland. And it had human markings of it, which was believed before then. They put human habitation in Ireland at 12,500 years ago, and that's now pushed it back to 33,000 years ago. So it's like, it was such an emotional day. But yeah, I just think that we've been on this land for thousands of years and living in, I suppose, you know, it's what people would call animism, you know, like that, living this really close and connected relationship with the land. And when I say the land, you know, I mean like the rocks, the lichens, the sea, the rivers, the skies, the stars, you know, all of it. Like particularly from a lot of the things that we have on our landscape here. So it's approaching winter solstice at the moment. So my mind will be going to these incredible passage tombs and the megalithic sites around Ireland, which would be constructed in line with the solstices or the equinoxes, which still draw in, you know, such a wide diversity of people. And I think that that's really felt here, that people end up at these sites and they're not quite sure why they're there, you know, like it could be like a family, or it could be people like a bunch of hippies, or it could be, you know, it's so diverse, like people on their iPhones or whatever. But there's still such a felt presence of that other world here, you know. We know from like our folklore that in Ireland, the other world is always present, you know, and there are times of the year and there are places where that it's closer to us. But it's just such a part of the mythology and the rituals and the traditions which still persist today. So yeah, it feels like something that's very important to tune in with and to give us meaning. Because I know personally, like having been raised Catholic, as soon as I was stopped being forced to go to church, it was like I didn't want anything to do with religion. And I was an atheist and I didn't believe with anything. And then coming into doing this work, I was always so concerned with cultural appropriation, and still am. And I think we should be. But I was so concerned with it that I was kind of afraid of practicing any kind of spirituality because I was afraid of appropriating another person's culture. And then realizing, well, there's so much here and there's so much written down. And there are these sites that were built across, you know, some of them were built across 500 years. So I'm just thinking like what the potency that like my ancestors, that our ancestors felt with these times of the year, with this land, that they would continue to build something across generations just to honor the light returning. Like not just to honor the light returning after, you know, that plunge into the darkness. So yeah, it feels very important to me at the moment to be working with people to kind of support each other to reforge that relationship, and also with young people as well. And, we're offering rites of passage for young people here in Ireland. And that's been such a heartening experience and such a powerful experience for a group of teenagers to be out on the land and to be exploring all of the topics which support them to navigate this really toxic cultural landscape. And then to have them find that strength in relationship with the land, and to find that strength in, recognizing trees as kin, or receiving teachings from moths, or bringing those parents and those families in as well, that we realize that, we can create and recreate our own rituals, which makes sense for this time and this place, and that it's really important that we do it as well as a source of strength moving forward.
Hey there, it's Andy from the Corporals Almanac. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast. As you can probably tell, this content involves extensive research and editing to release weekly episodes. If you think this content is valuable for the future that we inherit, please consider financially supporting this project by visiting corporals.com and clicking on the Patreon, Venmo, Ko-Fi, or PayPal tabs. Every dollar helps offset our costs for hosting the podcast content and helps offset hundreds of hours of work put towards this project monthly. Thank you for supporting us by sharing, liking, and donating to this project. Together, we can build a better future. I really appreciate that answer, and especially the personal component of it, because I think for myself, I am on a similar path where I was raised religious and became an atheist and wanted nothing to do and felt the same concerns about appropriation, but also acknowledging that there is something more within nature the closer I get to it. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's something that will someday be explained by science or whatever. I almost don't think it's really important whether or not it ever is, or whether or not that's an open-ended question. But it does draw in some important, I guess, understandings of our place within nature and time and space in a way that is important regardless of ancestral home. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's part of dealing with here, at least in the US, the fact that there is no ancestral home for 95% of the population here. Mm-hmm. And that's probably a conservative number. And the solution can't be to just go back, because there is no back for a lot of us, especially folks whose ancestry comes from different places. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something you probably also see. And I think that's why folks, especially in settler colonial places like Australia and the United States, they find a culture that is maybe the predominant one, or the one that's the most interesting, that they feel they most align with, that they kind of claw onto and then force themselves into in a lot of ways. But it's never going to be fully home. It's not our home. It's our ancestors' home. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think it's really important to be open and honest about that complicated relationship without fear of, again, that appropriation. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, if we can't be honest about it, then we're never going to solve the problem. And that's even just assuming that we can solve the problem. I'm not sure if we can, but there has to be some kind of motion forward. We can't stay in this space forever. And we're seeing that in civilization as it exists today in general. We're seeing this very fundamental breakdown in how we identify ourselves through technology and loss of space in identity, because everything is the same. Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested around this idea of that there is this large portion of folks that are trying to find this new connection with nature that I think has really accelerated over the last decade, I would say. In your experiences, do you think this is something that's speaking to more of our global capitalist economy, or is this a response to the role of technology in kind of replacing even the most basic relationships we have with other people? Or is this a response to COVID, or is it all of the above? I'm kind of interested to know from your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. And it's been so interesting in the past 2 years since COVID. My work has just accelerated here in Ireland, with the amount of people wanting to, quote unquote, reconnect with nature. And that's a brilliant thing, you know. And I think as many different avenues that there are for people to do that in whatever way can hopefully only be a good thing. Yeah, I suppose again, like for me, it's like always coming back to this idea of like, well, how is it that we're engaging when we go out there? You know, like, are we just considering this forest to be like the backdrop to this thing that we're doing, you know, like if we're going in there with the kind of colonial consumer mindset of just like, I'm going to extract from this place because I'm entitled to do so, and not this kind of long term, like spanning multiple generations relationship tending, which for me, like it really ought to be like engaging with the land in a way that it has sentience and that we're a part of that. So yeah, it will be really interesting to see how this pans out over the next decade of like a new generation of people who want to be outside. But certainly like in terms of, you know, I can speak a little bit to the forest school movement here in Ireland, which I've been involved in for about like 8 years now. Like that is just exploded, and that is specifically, you know, working with young people specifically and bringing them out to a natural space. Over like it might be a forest. It's not that many of them. It might be a forest, it could be the corner of a park, it could be the corner of a schoolyard, and just like working with the same group of young people over an extended period of time to help them grow in resilience and confidence and relationship with themselves and each other and the natural world. I think like especially like, you know, what really kind of opened me to that world was the Last Child in the Woods book by Richard Louv, which I think was written in the early 2000s. And that was coming out of the States, you know, of like seeing the impacts of children being taken away from any kind of risk or any kind of interaction with the natural world, of even with like gross motor skills, not being able to like walk across uneven ground, and that lack of freedom, you know, like this kind of like helicopter parenting where we don't want the child to get hurt, so we are just keeping them indoors. And like, what are the implications of that? When I began my forest school in 2015, like I was really lucky to have maybe 4 kids sign up. And now, you know, we're training, like we trained about 70 new forest school leaders this year, and that's happening in 3 different parts of the country. And a lot of these people that are coming to the training are teachers or they're principals of schools. It's for the first time for them as adults even to have found this connection with nature, or have learned how to light a fire or to use a saw. So it's incredibly empowering and transformational for people who have been entrenched in systems of education their whole lives to suddenly go into that wide angled vision of, oh wow, like there's so much happening around me. And then come into like a community of other forest school leaders who are so supportive of one another and who all care. Like they might not use the same language as me in terms of like cultural or ecological restoration, but at the heart of it, that's what it's about, you know. And like trying to figure out what is this, because it was something that was created in the UK and it was inspired by how children learn in Scandinavia. So as a movement, kind of as a pioneering movement of this, it's like, why does this make sense? And what is it like? What is it on the island of Ireland for a school? You know, it's going to be different. You know, it's going to be like have a lot of our traditions. It's going to have Irish in it. Yeah, I think people are beginning to understand that our systems are very fragile. That became very clear to people in the early days of COVID. And the time that people were afforded, obviously not everybody, and for some people it was just such a vastly different experience for so many people. But I know like here, just people having that moment to kind of breathe and to reassess and to think about, well, like what is it that I want for my life or my family's life? And taking like in the, you know, the very beginning of COVID, we were restricted to a 2 kilometer radius, you know. So like for people who had never explored outside their front door before or met their neighbors before, there was a lot of really beautiful things that happened, you know, that people were able to start considering the place that they find themselves in. Yeah, that's a lot of rambling.
No, it's all very relevant. I think COVID was the fast forward button on things that we were already experiencing, and we just had a moment to breathe and just look around and
Yeah.
say, how did I end up here? At least that's how I imagine a lot of folks. You're on this train trying to get to some end that you think, well, when I get there, I
Yeah.
can stop and breathe and assess, and I'll have the resources to pivot or
Mhm.
whatever it might be. And COVID was like, nope, this is a stop, and we don't know when we're going to go again. And it was like, okay, well, why am I here, and where even am I? And I think that was a big wake up call for a lot of folks.
Mhm.
It's like you said, folks start looking around where they live and becoming more aware of what's around them. Whether I think early on, the toilet paper thing fed into like a lot of understanding of how easily things can kind of dissipate, especially resources.
Mhm.
As somebody that does forage a bit, I personally became very concerned about, at least here in the United States, a lot of folks do forage, but it's always like only take what you need, but without any thought of also plant more things. And what are you doing to help regenerate those species
Yeah.
so that there's more for everyone? Because if everyone takes an eighth, eventually that 15th person that's taking an eighth
Mhm.
is not taking much at all, and the plant is probably dying.
Mhm.
That speaks to our very extractive understanding of our relationship with nature.
Mhm.
Whereas even if we understand that we can have this relationship, a lot of people, most foragers and people that are very into ecology included, don't think about how do I give back to those spaces,
Mhm.
even if I appreciate and care about them and try to protect them.
Mhm.
And I think that's where a lot of what this type of stuff, this rewilding, is particularly important, because you're building that duality within the relationship that's not necessarily extractive,
Mhm.
but rather constructive.
Mhm.
In my opinion, that as much as the ancestral skills and the spiritual skills are important, or the spiritual reconnection
Mhm.
is important, but finding how we can be productive members of those ecologies, I think, is by far the most important
Mhm.
component of this relationship.
Yeah, no, I would really agree with that. And it's, so much of this is about Indigenous sovereignty as well, like, isn't it? Of like the people who have tended these lands for generations, who know when the best time to harvest certain plants are, or how, they are the reason that these places are so beautiful and so thriving, looking to people to learn in that way as well. And also, like, what is the state management of the land and access to green spaces as well? That there are so many people that I know who live in the city and they don't have access to go out and to forage for food because of whatever chemicals are being spread, or that there just isn't access to green spaces outside of these urban spaces. So there's lots of different levels of it, isn't there? Because I know, like, I'm a part of it's a global, though kind of a lot of the membership is in the UK, the Association of Foragers. And a large part of that is like our responsibility as foragers to forage in a way that is ethical and sustainable. And yeah, it's just like really breaking down what that means, because it's going to look very different on many different landscapes and for many different plants or fungi or whatever that is. And I think that's always like why coming back to like this critical examination of our mindset and the way in which our minds have been colonized to like think that, we can just take this without ever entering into a relationship with a particular landscape or plant, that it's just extractive. And actually how, for me personally, like, I love going out and foraging plants. I feel so nourished just by being outside and being with a plant in that way. I come home and I eat it, and I know that I'm getting so much more nourishment from that plant or mushroom or whatever it is than if I'd gone to the shop to buy it. But then actually, like, that act of giving back as well is like completes that cycle. It's like, oh, I feel like I haven't just gone round to my friend's house and like eaten loads of food out of their cupboard and then just left and I never cook them dinner again. It's like, this
Yeah.
is, yeah, if we're really feeling like that this is a animate, world, then, and that we are a part of it, then we have like this niche to fulfill, which is also to save the seed. It's also to go in and to remove introduced species, or to cut the woodland in a way that lets in more light, or that doesn't harvest in a way that is going to completely deplete a species. And that is so specific for whatever place or being it is that you're interacting with. So, I mean, it feels very overwhelming, like I'm always trying to strike this balance when I teach foraging to people, that it's like I want people to engage with it. And I think this speaks to the question you were asking about of people who might feel really daunted by beginning this, because I am asking that people like really think about it. And also it's just like when I teach foraging, it's so often like the most common plants that we find here, like it's our dandelions and our nettles and our plantain that are so easy identifiable, and people recognize them and they know them, but they don't know them, they don't know they haven't experienced them maybe in lots of different ways of eating or medicine, or explored where they grow or how they grow and when they flower and what animals are coming to visit them and feeding off them as well. And I think it's like this book that's continually giving.
I appreciate that, because I think it is something that's not talked about a lot. This idea of having a relationship where we can make the ecology better through our interaction with it. There's obviously this very big movement to leave nature alone and whatever. That conversation's been had by a lot of folks. But when we talk about, I think of us like an oak tree. When oaks drop their leaves, they create the best conditions for them to continue thriving. And that doesn't make the forest worse. It makes it incredibly better, because there are species that also do incredibly well in that same space. And they can have such a positive impact just by trying to make the environment better for themselves. And in a lot of ways, that's how we are, or we can be at least. The last couple thousand years might speak negatively on that idea, but we can impact environments through our knowledge and skills that have been honed for 100,000 years to make environments better and more productive. And that can be really daunting for a lot of people. It feels, I think, for a lot of folks like that, there's a lot of pressure to suggest we can have that positive of an impact. Whereas it's easier to just say, we're a parasite on the planet or something like that. And to flip that and speak about how great we can be, I think is really important in breaking some of those psychological barriers of people going out into the forest. And it's like, okay, I'll harvest these mushrooms or these, plants or whatever it might be, these berries. But for the most part, I'm not really significantly impacting that forest. I'm taking the bare minimum and that's it. So I'm getting something, but I'm not doing too much harm, as opposed to thinking about, like you had said, increasing light penetration, thoughtful management of coppicing and pollarding and species that are good for us and also other animals that might otherwise struggle more if we don't intervene. And that's really important, and building confidence in people, and also giving them that sense of place, and both in terms of the physical location as well as place within the linear time of people on that landscape. So for folks that have enjoyed this conversation, where can they find more of your work, or if they want to do one of your classes?
Yes, so I have a fancy new website. That was something that came out of one lockdown. So it's wildawake.ie, and I put all of my classes up there. And then aside from there, I'm very active on Instagram. So it's Wild Awake Ireland on Instagram. Yeah.
Awesome. And are you still doing classes right now, or how does that look?
At the moment, no, I'm in my winter hibernation time, and I'll be starting up classes again in March 2022. It feels very strange to say that, but yeah, it'll be March 2022.
Yeah, well, that'll be here sooner than we think.
I know. Yeah.
So, Lucy, this has been great. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been wonderful. Thanks again for asking me to speak with you.